The appraisal sat in my hands like it belonged to someone else's life. $2.1 million. Pending marina overlay approval, the stamp read, in flat black government print. I stood in the county clerk's parking lot, keys to a cabin I hadn't seen in 11 years shaking in my hand, the metal ring rattling against my wedding band, worn thin from 44 long years of marriage. 3 weeks earlier, I would have laughed if you told me I'd end up standing here. 3 weeks earlier, I sat in a leather chair across from my late husband's attorney, listening to him read Walter's will aloud in a room that smelled of furniture polish and old coffee. He said Marcus's name first. The house. All $1.5 million of it, the life Walter and I had actually built. Then he said mine. And to Christine, he read. The Miller's Point cabin and surrounding acreage. I heard my son exhale through his nose. Not quite a laugh. Just enough of one. Nobody in that room said what they were clearly thinking, that I'd been handed the leftovers. A rotting cabin on a forgotten lake, while my son inherited the house we'd spent 44 years turning into a home. I folded my copy of the will in half and said nothing. Now I stood outside that same cabin, appraisal in one hand, keys in the other, staring at a lock with a date stamped into its metal plate. October 1994. The year Walter and I bought this place for $22,000, when neither of us could have guessed what it would one day be worth. I turned the key. Before I tell you what I found behind that door, welcome. If you're here, chances are you know what it feels like to be underestimated by the people who should know you best. This channel is for women like us, the ones who stayed quiet, stayed patient, and turned out to be right all along. If that sounds familiar, hit subscribe. There are more stories like mine waiting for you. And this one is far from over. To understand why that lock, that date, and that appraisal meant something to me, you have to understand what I did for a living. For 31 years, I worked as a title examiner for a regional bank. Most people hear that job title and their eyes glaze over, and I understand why. My work was deeds, easements, zoning filings, and boundary surveys, the kind of paperwork most people sign without reading, the fine print buried under fine print. I read it. Every clause, every recorded amendment, every line item that told you what a piece of land actually was, not what someone assumed it to be. I retired in 2019 after 31 years in that chair. And I thought I was done reading other people's fine print for good. Walter, my husband, was a civil engineer. For most of his career, he worked on county infrastructure projects. Roads, drainage systems, the kind of unglamorous work that keeps a place running without anyone noticing it's being done. He understood land the way I understood paper. Between the two of us, there wasn't much about a piece of property, on record or on the ground, that could slip past unnoticed. In 1994, we bought a small cabin on Miller's Point, out on the lake, for $22,000. It wasn't an investment. It was a weekend retreat, a place to get away from telephones and deadlines, somewhere our son could learn to fish off a dock that wobbled a little more every summer. We went up there most Julys for 2 decades, then slowly less often. By the time Walter passed, I hadn't set foot on that property in 11 years. Here's the part one didn't think much of at the time, though I think about it constantly now. In his final 2 years, Walter grew strange about that cabin's paperwork. Strange isn't a word I use about him lightly. He was a steady man, not prone to secrecy. But he started handling the lake property paperwork, as he called it, entirely on his own. He stopped routing it through Halloran, the estate attorney we'd used for almost every other piece of our finances for 2 decades. He'd disappear into his study some evenings with a folder I never saw the inside of, and when I asked what he was working on, he'd say something like, "Just making sure it's all in order," and change the subject. At the time, I chalked it up to a man in his late 60s keeping busy, tidying loose ends the way people do when they sense their time is shortening. I didn't press him on it. I wish now that I had asked more questions. But some part of me, the part that spent 31 years reading what other people tried to leave unread, must have filed it away somewhere, because standing outside that cabin 3 weeks after the will reading, that memory was the first thing that came back to me. From the outside, we looked like an ordinary family. Marcus is 41, a regional manager for a logistics company, married to his wife Danielle, with 2 kids in middle school. He does well enough on paper, but between the mortgage, 2 car payments, and private tuition for the kids, money was always tighter than he liked people to know. He cared deeply about how things looked. At every holiday, every birthday, every hospital visit during Walter's final years, Marcus made sure everyone noticed he was there. "I'm the one who actually shows up," he'd say, usually within earshot of me, as if attendance were the only currency that mattered. Walter and I had been married 44 years when he died 8 months ago, suddenly of a cardiac event, on a Tuesday morning while reading the newspaper at our kitchen table. 44 years of built routines, inside jokes, and a partnership so ordinary it had become invisible to both of us. I still reach for his coffee cup some mornings before I remember. In the last year of his life, I noticed something shifting at our family dinners, something I didn't have a name for then. Marcus had started speaking over me. Not cruelly, just casually, the way you talk over someone whose opinion didn't carry real weight. When I'd mentioned something about the house, our finances, even the cabin, he'd redirect the conversation to Walter, as if my thoughts were sentimental static rather than informed judgment. Walter would sometimes catch my eye across the table, say nothing, and let it pass. I let it pass too. I didn't know yet how much that quiet dismissal would matter. The conference room at Halloran's office smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. I sat between Marcus and Danielle, my hands folded in my lap, watching the attorney square a stack of papers against the table before he began. Walter had been gone 3 weeks. This was the first time since the funeral that the 4 of us had been in a room together with nothing to do but listen. "To my son Marcus," the attorney read, "I leave the property located at 4419 Ashworth Lane. Our house, the one Walter and I had lived in for 30 years, the one worth $1.5 million, in its entirety." Marcus's face changed instantly. He sat up a little straighter. A small, satisfied smile crossed his mouth, the kind he used to get as a boy when he'd won something he'd been angling for all along. Danielle reached over and squeezed his hand under the table, not quiet enough that I didn't notice. The attorney continued, "To my wife Christine, I leave the property located at Miller's Point, commonly known as the Lake Cabin, and the surrounding acreage as recorded." The room went still for half a second. Then Marcus turned toward me, and the smile that had settled on his face shifted into something else. Not quite cruel but close enough. He leaned over, his voice pitched just loud enough for the whole room to hear. "Well, Mom," he said, "at least you'll have somewhere to retire to, assuming it hasn't fallen into the lake by now." Danielle laughed. Not loudly, just a short exhale through her nose, quickly covered by her hand, but I heard it. I saw it. The attorney's eyes flicked toward me, then back down to his papers, the way people look away when they don't know what to do with secondhand embarrassment. I didn't respond right away. I looked at the copy of the will in my hands, at Walter's careful phrasing, "as recorded." A phrase most people would skim past without a second thought. Most people. Not me. 31 years of reading documents most people never looked at twice had trained something in me that didn't switch off just because I was sitting in a room being laughed at by my own son. I folded the papers in half precisely, the crease running straight down the center of the page, and set them on my lap. "Thank you," I said, to no one in particular and nothing else. Marcus didn't seem to notice or didn't care to. He was already talking to Danielle about contractors, about what they might do with the house, his voice warm and easy in a way it hadn't been with me in longer than I wanted to admit. I sat there quiet and let him talk. I didn't say anything to Marcus on the way out of that office. I didn't say anything in the elevator or in the parking lot or when he offered, almost as an afterthought, to walk me to my car. I just nodded, told him I was fine, and drove home with the radio off, the will sitting on the passenger seat where I could see it out of the corner of my eye the entire way. As recorded. 3 words most people would never notice, buried in the middle of a sentence about a cabin nobody thought was worth fighting over. But I had spent 31 years of my life reading between exactly those kinds of lines. Documents don't repeat themselves by accident. Lawyers don't add phrases like "as recorded" unless there's something specific being recorded. Something with a file number, a date, a place it lives in some county office waiting to be pulled. I could have called Marcus that night. I could have told him what I suspected, asked him what he knew, made it a conversation instead of a silence. I didn't. Something in me, the same instinct that used to catch a misfiled easement before it cost a bank a lawsuit, told me to wait, to look before I spoke. That night, I went to the hall closet and pulled my old work satchel down from the top shelf, the leather cracked now, still smelling faintly of the office I'd left 5 years earlier. I set it on the kitchen table and started making a list. It took me 3 weeks to make the drive. Partly because I needed the time, and partly because some part of me already sensed that once I walked through that door, there would be no going back to not knowing. The lock turned easier than I expected, though the door itself stuck along the bottom, swollen from years of lake damp, and I had to put my shoulder into it before it gave way. Inside, the cabin looked exactly like a place left alone for 11 years. Dust thick enough to write in, mouse droppings scattered along the baseboards, a musty smell that caught in the back of my throat. For a moment, standing there, I almost believed Marcus's joke at the will reading had been right after all. Just an old cabin falling apart, worth exactly as much as it looked. Then I remembered the floorboard. Third one in from the fireplace in the little back room Walter used as a workshop. He complained about it every single summer we came up here, said it had warped wrong from the day it was laid. Always a little loose underfoot no matter how many times he nailed it back down. I knelt down, pressed my fingers into the gap at its edge and pried it up. Underneath was a small fireproof lockbox, gray metal, the kind you'd keep important documents safe from fire or flood. There was a brass tag fastened to the lid. Not Marcus's name. Mine. Christine. My hands were shaking again by the time I got it open. Inside 3 things. A set of surveyor's stamps, the kind used to certify official land documents. A letter folded twice in Walter's unmistakable handwriting, small, slanted, the same hand that had written me notes for 44 years. And a manila envelope sealed, with 6 words written across the front in black marker. Christine, open before you sign anything. I sat back on the dusty floor of that workshop, the envelope resting in my lap, my husband's handwriting staring back at me from beyond 8 months of silence. I hadn't signed anything yet. Not the deed transfer papers Marcus had already started asking about. Not one single thing. I want to know what you think Walter left me in that envelope. Tell me in the comments. I promise you what I found inside changed everything. I opened the envelope before I opened the letter, my hand still unsteady. Inside were copies of filings I didn't recognize yet, stamped with a county seal. I set them aside and unfolded Walter's letter instead. His handwriting filled 2 full pages. He wrote that 2 years before he died, an old colleague from his infrastructure days had mentioned, almost in passing, that the county was quietly moving forward with a rezoning proposal for Miller's Point, a marina and a lakefront commercial corridor, still years from public announcement, but already working its way through preliminary planning approvals. Walter, understanding land the way he did, recognized what that meant before almost anyone else in the county did. He told no one. Not his engineering friends, not Halloran, not Marcus, and not me. Instead, he quietly placed the cabin and its surrounding acreage into an irrevocable trust, in my name alone, specifically so it could never be contested, divided, or folded into the general estate no matter what happened to him. I didn't want anyone deciding what should happen to that land except you, he wrote. You'll understand why once you look into it. You always did read things more carefully than the rest of us. I sat with that letter for a long while before I made a single phone call. The next morning I called Denise, a woman I'd worked alongside at the bank for over a decade before I retired, still employed at the county recorder's office. I gave her the trust number listed in Walter's paperwork. 15 minutes later she called back, quieter than usual. The trust was real, filed exactly 2 years before Walter's death. Exactly as he described it. Irrevocable, meaning it couldn't be undone or reassigned by anyone, including me, without triggering a lengthy legal process. And the rezoning overlay was real too, moving through committee, just as he'd said. A few days after that, I sat across from a land use attorney named Mr. Okafor, a man Halloran had recommended when I explained I needed someone who specialized in zoning and trusts. He reviewed every document I brought him 1 page at a time before finally looking up. This trust is airtight, he told me, and this property's assessed value has already been quietly revised upward, ahead of the public rezoning announcement. Mrs. Christine, based on what I'm seeing here, that cabin of yours is worth considerably more than most people in your family probably think. Marcus showed up at my house on a Thursday evening unannounced, still in his work clothes, his car parked at an angle in my driveway like he'd pulled in without thinking about it. I opened the door before he had a chance to knock a second time. Can we talk? He said, already stepping past me into the front hall. I made him a cup of coffee he didn't drink and sat across from him at the kitchen table, The same table where I'd unfolded his father's will 3 weeks earlier. He got to the point quickly. I heard from Aunt Robin's side that there's some kind of development thing happening out near the lake, he said. Some marina project, maybe. I don't know all the details yet, but people are saying property values out there are about to jump. I said nothing, just wrapped my hands around my own untouched cup. Look, he went on, leaning forward. I think you should sign the cabin over. We could sell it as a family asset, split whatever it brings in. You don't even know what that land's worth, Mom. Let me handle it before you lose money on it. Before some developer talks you into a bad deal. I looked at him for a long moment, this man I had raised, sitting in my kitchen trying to relieve me of a property he still believed was worthless dead weight only weeks earlier. I'll think about it, I said, my voice even giving nothing away. He nodded, satisfied, clearly expecting me to come around soon enough. He didn't ask a single question about what I already knew. He never has been much for questions when he thinks he already has the answer. I called Marcus a few days later and told him I'd thought it over, that I wanted to discuss the cabin properly, and that I'd arranged for us to meet with an attorney to go over everything. He sounded pleased, almost relieved, certain this meant I'd come around to his way of thinking. Mr. Okafor's office was quiet and orderly, nothing like the room where Halloran had read Walter's will. Marcus sat beside me, comfortable, already halfway to a smile, while Mr. Okafor opened a folder and began laying documents across the table one at a time. He explained the trust first, irrevocable, filed 2 years before Walter's death, naming me as sole beneficiary, structured specifically so it could never be contested, divided, or absorbed into the general estate. Then he explained the rezoning overlay, moving through county committee, confirmed and on record. Then finally the number. Based on the pending marina overlay and the revised assessment, Mr. Okafor said. The Millers Point property is currently valued at $2.1 million. That's nearly $600,000 more than the Ashworth Lane property. The room went silent. Marcus's smile hadn't fully disappeared yet, but it had stopped moving, frozen somewhere between disbelief and the beginning of understanding. That's not possible, he said quietly. That cabin is falling apart. The land underneath it isn't, Mr. Okafor replied. I let the silence sit there a moment longer before I spoke, my voice steady, without a trace of triumph in it. Your father knew exactly what he was doing, I said. He just didn't think you'd need to know until now. Marcus didn't say anything back. He sat there, staring at the documents in front of him, the color draining slowly out of his face, while I folded my hands in my lap and waited. I drove back out to Millers Point alone a week later. The same road, the same swollen door sticking along the bottom the way it always had. But it looked different to me this time. Where I used to see rot and neglect, I saw potential now, and something close to irony. The piece of our estate everyone had dismissed turning out to be the one Walter trusted me with on purpose. I decided not to sell. Not out of spite and not to prove a point to Marcus, but because selling felt like walking away from something Walter had built quietly, carefully, just for me. I started meeting with contractors instead, sketching out what a small, respectful development might look like, honoring what he'd seen coming long before anyone else did. Marcus and I are civil now, though something between us has cooled that I don't expect will fully warm again. I've made peace with that. I spent so many years needing him to see me clearly. I don't anymore. I already know exactly what I'm capable of. Marcus still calls sometimes, always circling back to the property. I let him talk. Some doors, once you've unlocked them yourself, don't need anyone else's key. If this story reminded you of a moment when someone underestimated you, subscribe and share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more stories like mine coming.